Cari soci della Dante di Anversa, io sono Ann Pierssens e anch'io ho un contributo per celebrare il sommo poeta. Una videoconferenza in inglese perché vi voglio parlare dallo stretto rapporto che intercorre fra Dante Alighieri e James Joyce. Studiando Joyce all'Università di Anversa ho scoperto che i due autori hanno molto in comune e perciò ho deciso di approfondire l'argomento e condividere con voi i miei studi. In quale lingua? In inglese, perché i veri amanti di Dante sanno apprezzare la bellezza di ogni lingua, non solo dell'italiano. Qualche tempo fa lessi un articolo molto interessante del professor Marco Santagata, pubblicato nel gennaio 2016 nella rivista Apice, edita dalla Società Dante Alighieri. Il numero della rivista era dedicato ai 750 anni della nascita di Dante e la mia attenzione fu colpita da un articolo del professor Marco Santagata in cui, in un passaggio, definiva Ulisse e la commedia come testi che hanno in comune una cosa molto importante. Sono testi che fondano la modernità. Parlare degli Ulysses di Joyce è anche molto attuale perché in Italia è apparsa da pochi mesi una nuova traduzione di Ulysses edita dalla casa editrice La Nave di Teseo.
Although Joyce was already very interested in the Italian language from a young age, and he had studied the most important authors of the late Middle Ages like Dante in college, it is not until his sojourn in Trieste that he became fluent in the Italian language. Corinna del Greco-Lobner claims that Almidano Artifoni, Joyce's first interlocutor and director at the Berlitz school where Joyce began working, stated that Joyce, on his arrival, spoke an Italiano trecentesco, or an almost medieval Italian. Living in Trieste not only deepened Joyce's love for the Italian language and culture, it also created a special friendship with Italo Svevo, an Italian writer, which would be fundamental to both their oeuvre. Without this knowledge of both the Italian language, his affiliation for Dante and his friendship with Italo Svevo, Joyce's masterpiece Ulysses would never have resulted in what it is today. Furthermore, residing in Trieste was of the utmost importance for Joyce to be able to infuse so much of the Italian culture and language into Ulysses, or as Neil R. Davison states, Trieste changed Joyce, and Svevo's influence may have been at the forefront of that change, explaining thus that without his friendship with Svevo, Joyce's Ulysses might have turned out a completely different novel. When James Joyce met his future wife Nora in June 1904, he was living in the Martello Tower together with Oliver St. John Gogarty, a medical student. Because the cohabitation did not result in a success, Joyce asked Nora to move with him to Zurich, where he thought to have a job waiting for him. Unfortunately, this job did not exist. After a short stay in Trieste, they moved to Pola, where Joyce accepted a teaching position at the Berlitz school. The Joyces did not stay very long in Pola, because another teaching position in the same school had opened in Trieste. He moved there in March 1905, just in time to escape the elimination of aliens by the Austrians from Pola. Both Pola and Trieste were at that time under Austro-Hungarian rule, but especially in Trieste, Italian was still the most spoken language. Joyce was hired as an English teacher but continued to write. The city of Trieste, for Joyce, resembled a cultural higher ideal of Dublin. The rivers, the city's map and the atmosphere of both cities were very similar for Joyce, or as Eric Bulson states, the Italian echo, as he calls it, through Ireland. Furthermore, Bulson declares that Trieste, in short, resembled Dublin in its historical and social configurations to such a degree that it elicited a memory of an Irish culture and geography essential for a portrait and Ulysses. Ernesto Livorni adds that for Joyce, Trieste seemed like a small Ireland, which made him think about the original in a more serene way. Needless to say that for Joyce, his residence in the after World War I Italian city was of the utmost importance to be able to enrich Ulysses. Joyce and his wife Nora were very happy there, and one of the key elements that point to that happiness is that they gave their children Italian names, and Joyce would put emphasis on always using the Italian version of those names, Giorgio and Lucia. Unfortunately for the Joyce family, James was easily bored and interrupted their lives by moving to Rome from 1906 to 1907 to take a job at a bank, after which he returned to Trieste disillusioned. Besides 2 short visits to Dublin, the Joyce family stayed in Trieste until 1915, confined there by World War I, then moved to Zurich in Switzerland, but returned to Trieste from 1919 to 1920. Strangely enough, even though having stayed in a predominantly Catholic country, James and Nora did not marry until 1931 in London. As already stated, Joyce was a great admirer of the Italian language and culture, and in Ulysses this admiration becomes very clear in the use of the language throughout, in the different cultural pointers and in the naming of important Italian authors like Dante, Boccaccio and Brunetto Latini, and scientists like Galileo, Volta, Da Vinci and Spallanzani. In almost all of the chapters, at least 1 or 2 Italian words are strewn throughout the text, but especially in Stephen's chapters, the Italian language is to be found in abundance. This is still a remnant of the fact that, in a portrait, Stephen was the mirror of Joyce's own youth. On the one hand, Stephen's dialogues with Artifoni, named after the director of that Berlitz school, are almost completely in Italian. On the other hand, Leopold Bloom has issues with Italian, which makes it almost funny to read, because he only considers it to be a language to sing in. A beautiful language, I mean for singing purposes. Bloom's struggles with Italian become even more humoristic when he tries to imitate the language, bella donna, not realizing that he is not saying beautiful woman, but poisonous plant. Another humoristic example is when Bloom asks himself whether his wife pronounces something correctly, voglio e non vorrei. Wonder if she pronounces that right, voglio, which in itself is already a mistake on Bloom's part, because the correct sentence is vorrei e non vorrei da Don Giovanni. Another fact for Joyce to use Italian is that the swearing can be done in a language few people understand, enabling Joyce to use even the harshest insults. Joyce was not only an admirer of classical music, he was also a musically gifted man, as was his wife Nora. In an interview with Joyce's maid Mary Kern, Thomas Staley learned that little Giorgio had inherited Joyce's musical ability, and that the whole family would regularly sing together. This love for classical music, and especially opera, is also very present in Ulysses. Even though Joyce uses many Irish folk songs and English operas, the main returning work is Mozart's Don Giovanni, which was originally composed in Italian. Don Giovanni tells the story of a noble man who takes advantage of his situation to try and seduce as many women as possible. When he first sees the soon-to-be-married Zerlina, he immediately decides to have her. She is interested in his advances, but she's afraid he will leave her as soon as he has received what he wants. The duet La ci darem la mano is a constantly returning element in Ulysses, especially the phrasing vorrei e non vorrei spoken by Zerlina, which return in different versions throughout the novel. This story, and more specifically this duet, is a constant reminder of the affair Bloom's wife Molly is having with Blazes Boylan. Other musical references are the mentioning of 2 of the most famous tenors Caruso e Giuglini, and other operas like La Gioconda by Ponchielli and Il Trovatore by Verdi. He even uses the Italian version of Mozart's Die Zauberflöte instead of the German one, with Qui sdegno. There is also a reference to one of the most important Italian theatre authors, Carlo Goldoni. His Il servitore di due padroni from 1747 is used in the first chapter where Stephen answers Buck Mulligan with, "I am a servant of two masters." Joyce's fascination with 13th century Italian authors Dante, who deserves a chapter all of his own, and Boccaccio is even more present in Ulysses, although Boccaccio's Decameron is referred to only twice. The first time we encounter Boccaccio's spirit is when Stephen thinks about the ninth story of the sixth day in the Decameron, about Guido walking between graves and contemplating while being mocked by his companions. The second time the author is paraphrased is through Boccaccio's character Calandrino, a man known for his simple mind, but convinced he is brilliant and can outwit the others. In one of the stories of the Decameron, his friends convince him he is pregnant, and it is exactly this part which is used in Ulysses. Boccaccio's Calandrino was the first and last man who felt himself with child. Joyce's fascination for and influence by Dante has always been a point of agreement because from a young age on, he studied the 13th century master in depth. Carol Slade quotes James Joyce, "I love Dante almost as much as the Bible. He is my spiritual food, the rest being ballast." Mary T. Reynolds adds that, in Joyce's modernism, the connection with Dante is a medieval component that is everywhere present as the mark of a powerful early influence, absorbed and transformed. Both authors make it thus abundantly clear that the influence of Dante on Joyce is major. Some critics, like Howard Helsinger, believe that Joyce featured Stephen as a modern Dante, and he suggests as much by casting Stephen Dedalus as an Irish Dante. This fact is corroborated by the fact that Joyce created Stephen after his own image in a portrait, and that, as Corina del Greco Lobner tells us, Joyce himself was known in Trieste as the Dublin's Dante. Joyce was a fervent admirer of medieval literature, which he liked to incorporate into his modernist writing, or as Boldrini quotes Umberto Eco, Joyce was the node where the Middle Ages and the avant-garde met. The Joyce of Ulysses was perhaps the only one among the modernists to fully recognize that a simple opposition of medieval and modern was flawed, showing that it was exactly the mix of both genres that made Joyce special. Joyce had, on a personal level, more in common with Dante than he might have considered. Both authors were at one point in their lives exiled from their original hometowns for political reasons, Dublin and Florence, respectively. This had a profound influence on both, which echoes in their writing. Joyce's play, Exiles, written under the Italian name Giacomo Joyce, addresses this issue, and Mary T. Reynolds mentions that in this play, Joyce even reproduces the closing episode of Dante's Purgatorio, linking both authors again. The connection between both also involves another level. Dante and Joyce were both considered as creators of a new language. Barbara Tonello quotes Beckett in saying that Dante not only created a new language by taking the vernacular national dialects and mixing them into one, but that he also invented completely new words. This is, of course, where the similarities between Dante and Joyce became even more pronounced, as Joyce also created a completely new language with new vocabulary and a mixing of different languages. Joyce differs from Dante in that he used more humor in his creations than the Florentine writer. For example, the scene where Molly asks Bloom for the meaning of the word metempsychosis, and she answers, "Yes, who's he when he's at home?" Or further in the novel when she repeats the word but as "met him pike horses." Jolanta Wawrycka states that Joyce's description of Dublin as the infernal center of hemiplegia is very much like Dante's depiction of Florence, and they share the desire to exorcise the hellish aspects of their respective cities through art, which in Ulysses is very obvious. Joyce shows his love, but also his ennui for his native city in such an eloquent fashion that it becomes an art all in itself. The references to Dante's Divina Commedia are plentiful, both in a literal as in a more hidden approach. Carol Slade views the link to Dante in an almost literal way as Leopold Bloom's voyage through hell, purgatory, to a vision of paradise, linking Bloom's suffering from Molly's affair to hell, but likewise distinguishing a positive ending of the novel. To explain all of the references will be impossible because there are so many that one would need a whole book to do them justice, but some examples will be explained. In Proteus, Stephen quotes Dante with one of the most famous sentences of the Divina Commedia, Maestro di color che sanno, the master of those who know. Dante wrote this sentence while he is in limbo and where he meets famous non-Christian poets such as Homer and Virgil, and when he raises his eyes, he sees the master of all, Aristotle. Stephen at this point is thinking about poets and he wants to be one, but he is also referring to the master of all, Aristotle. Another very famous sentence, again spoken by Stephen, is nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, meaning to be halfway life, having the age of 35 years in Dantescan times. In this specific paragraph, Joyce even combines Dante with Boccaccio by naming also Calandrino. Together with even Shakespeare, these important authors serve to describe a father figure, the finding of which is Stephen's actual goal. In chapter 9, where Stephen is protagonist, many sentences come from the Divina Commedia. Two of them are even linked between each other as they have a backside in common. Ed egli avea del cul fatto trombetta, meaning having a backside formed like a trumpet, and they creepy crawl after Blake's buttocks, where it refers to Dante and Virgil crawling over Satan's buttocks. Another striking example of Joyce's mix with Dante and humor is when Stephen cites he souls, she souls, shoals of souls on page 157, referring to Dante's Canto 5, where the carnal sinners are shrieking and moaning in a never-ending storm. This phrase in Dante's work is nowadays almost felt as a poetical tongue-twister. Amor che nulla amato amar perdona, where Francesca's relationship with her husband's brother is discovered by her violent husband Gianciotto. So Joyce added his own version, reminiscent of the English tongue-twister, she sells seashells by the seashore. There are more than 11 other instances in which Joyce quotes or paraphrases Dante, especially in the thoughts of Stephen, from all three parts of the Divina Commedia, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, but explaining all is impossible here. A last example that Mary T. Reynolds recounts is at the end of the novel, when Molly is thinking about a rose. Shall I wear a white rose? Followed by, or shall I wear a red? Yes. This is the last connection to Dante's Paradiso by using the Candida Rosa, or pure white rose. The difference between both, this time, resides in the fact that Dante's Beatrice was, according to Reynolds, l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle, or the divine love, symbolized by the white rose, where in Ulysses Molly will choose the red one, the earthly love. Reynolds continues by saying that the key to Joyce's pattern, insofar as it may involve a meditation on Dante's treatment of the theme of love, seems to be an ironic mistrust of the mystical view of love, which is shown in a crystal clear way by Molly's affair and Bloom's knowledge about it. With this last example, the link between Joyce and Dante has come full circle again, as Dante's referrals commence in the first chapter and end in the last one. Ettore Schmitz, better known as Italo Svevo, met Joyce in Trieste in the autumn of 1907, where he would, to improve his English, become Joyce's student. Both men, being writers, developed a friendship even though there was a reasonable age difference between them. A friendship that lasted until Svevo died in a car accident in 1928. Davison states that Schmitz's personal warmth may have come to represent to Joyce a welcome antithesis to his own biological father, because Schmitz did not drink, gamble, or brag about his money or his past, showing the need for Joyce to find a replacement of a father figure, a need that is also well imbibed into Stephen Dedalus. When they met, Svevo had already written 2 novels, while Joyce had only published 3 short stories. Svevo was a Jew who, according to Ernesto Livorno, left behind his Jewish identity and changed it for a literary one, choosing a pseudonym in which 2 Middle European ethnicities were combined. Davison states that, although he had been baptized a Catholic at the request of his wife, Schmitz still considered himself a Jew. Davison continues that this ambiguous sentiment toward 2 religions were for Joyce a correlative for his own ambivalence toward Catholicism and yet inescapable preoccupation with Irishness, meaning that they also had more in common than one might think at first glance. Svevo's Jewishness was probably the foundation for Joyce's Bloom, even though Ira Bruce Nadel claims that Joyce's fascination originated in the fact that both Joyce and the Jews had their roots in their exilic isolation. Nadel furthermore states that Joyce was influenced by a book written by Guglielmo Ferrero, La Europa Giovane, in which he described the characteristics of Jews in a more positive way as presenting intuitiveness, imagination, idealism, and passion for moral criticism, character traits that could almost fit Leopold Bloom too. Some critics, like Joyce's biographer Ellman, Livorno and Maloney, agree instead that Svevo was the model on whom Joyce created Leopold Bloom, because, as Davison states, Svevo's portrait stood in Joyce's Zurich study. Staley adds that Svevo even resembled Bloom physically. There are elements that point to Svevo being the model for Bloom, as both were Jews, albeit not practicing ones, and both were married to Catholic women. Another element that points to Svevo is the fact that Ettore Schmitz changed his name, as already stated, and that his ancestors came from Hungary, just like Bloom's. An added factor is the age difference between Bloom and Stephen, which is exactly the same as the one between Joyce and Svevo, although Livorni states that Svevo's widow Livia did not agree on that point. Livorni furthermore quotes Joyce's biographer Ellman on Bloom's character. This prototype was almost certainly Ettore Schmitz, whose grandfather came from Hungary, and who wore the moustache that Joyce gave to Bloom, and like Bloom had a wife and daughter. Staley adds that Stanislaus Joyce commented that, and it may not be too far-fetched to see in the person of Bloom, Svevo's mature, objective, peaceable temper reacting upon the younger writer's more fiery metal, giving thus even more credence to Svevo having modelled for Bloom. Staley furthermore recounts the fact that when Joyce and Svevo walked around Trieste, the plump, middle-aged Trieste businessman and the frail, youthful Joyce, it was like looking at Bloom and Stephen. Both Svevo and Joyce influenced each other as writers. Joyce's efforts to make Svevo's La coscienza di Zeno popular in Europe are well known according to Staley, but their mutual influence goes even further. That Joyce and Dante had a love for creating language has already been said, but also Svevo was a master of creation. Corinna Loppner states that Svevo liked to use altered words to express humor, and that he used a lot of suffixes to keep changing words, a technique that Joyce used to a great extent in his Italian writing. Although they influenced each other, Svevo was already a mature writer and was less inclined to experiment with style. He even says, as Maloney quotes, "The huge virtuosity of Joyce is, I think, a huge danger," showing that Svevo had some trepidation about Joyce's experimentalism. Besides the love for creating language, Joyce also took the liberty to use certain elements of Svevo's work and turned it into his own. When we meet Stephen in Ulysses, his mother has already died, and the boy is still struggling with the fact that he let her down on her deathbed by not wanting to kneel for a prayer. Or as Mulligan voices it, "You could have knelt down when your dying mother asked you." The difficult relationship between Stephen and his mother is in fact, according to Livorni, probably based upon two stories written by Svevo, La Madre e La Buonissima, in which Svevo had already used the difficulties between child and mother, albeit in animal form. Although critics point to the fact that La Madre was published only in 1924, thus after Ulysses, Livorno tells that Svevo's widow testified that a first version of this story was already available in 1910, so the probability that Joyce had read it is profound. Another example, according to Livorni, is of Svevo's Buon Vecchio, a character that almost resembles Bloom, and his relationship with La Bella Fanciulla, or the beautiful girl, a relationship copied in Joyce's chapter Nausicaa. The difference between relationships is crystal clear. Bloom's one is superficial, whereas Svevo's Buon Vecchio's is more profound and of longer duration. Staley hands us even another element of influence of Svevo on Joyce, the fact that Joyce used Svevo's wife as one of the heroines in Finnegan's Wake, Livia, for Anna Livia Plurabelle. An ultimate connection between both authors is the fact that because of Svevo, Joyce came in contact with psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was, according to Nadel, first introduced in Italy in 1910 by a family member by marriage of Svevo, Edoardo Weiss. This introduction to psychoanalysis deeply interested Joyce, and he made use of it to further explain Stephen's Oedipus complex. Davison explains how through the transformation and adjustment of Stephen and his aesthetic theories, from the Stephen in the first chapters of Stephen Hero to the one in a portrait to the ultimate one in Ulysses, we can begin to unravel how Joyce's self-image as a male and thus his relationship to his own fictional alter ego had matured as a result of Schmitz's influence, meaning that Stephen, thanks to the techniques of psychoanalysis, matured throughout the three novels. For Joyce, finding in Svevo a replacement father figure made him able to give one to Stephen in the form of Leopold Bloom. James Joyce's fascination for the Italian language and his admiration for writers as Dante were already established from a young age on. This fascination for either, and the fact that he did not feel at home anymore in his native Ireland, were the reasons for his exile to Trieste. This exile, fortunately for Joyce, resulted into an even more profound knowledge of the Italian language, but furthermore culminated into a deep friendship with Ettore Schmitz, better known as Italo Svevo. This friendship had mutual benefits as both authors influenced each other. Svevo not only helped Joyce figure out the issues with the Stephen Dedalus character, he even stood model for the other main character of Ulysses, Leopold Bloom. Not only Svevo, but also Dante's Divina Commedia was one of the major forces upon Joyce's Ulysses. The several open and hidden references are testimony of said force. Bloom's wanderings throughout June 16, 1904, are compatible with Dante's wandering through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Furthermore, Joyce's sojourn in Trieste was the catalyst to envisage and start the whole voyage of Ulysses, because there he could love his Ireland again the way he once did, but also describe its more negative sides in a more objective way. Needless to say that without the three elements, Svevo, Dante, and Trieste, Joyce would not have been capable of writing his masterpiece as we now know it.